thank you all for coming, especially those of you who aren't required to be here for your religion and medicine class. I want to thank Justin for visiting us from British Columbia, Vancouver. We were lucky enough that Dr. Stein has some family in town, so that kind of sweetened the deal and made it easier for me to coax him to come down and talk to our students. So I'll just do a brief introduction, and then I'll just let you take it away. Professor Stein has his master's in Asian religions from University of Hawaii, or is it religious studies, Asian religions specifically, from University of Hawaii, Manoa, and his PhD in religion from the University of Toronto. He also completed a 2-year Japan Society for the Promotion of Science postdoctoral fellowship at Bukkyo University, the University of Buddhism in Kyoto, and I was lucky enough to kind of intersect with him at some point, and you are just like an amazing host who both showed me the best sake bar that I've ever been to, which was the most random little nook in a back alley, but also taught me the secrets, the esoteric secrets to visiting Mount Kurama, which is a significant site in the history of the development of Reiki. So that was very cool to have Justin as a host for just a few days there. He's currently the Director of Asian Studies at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, and he's one of the editors of the Routledge Handbook of Religion, Medicine, and Health, which I've just ordered for our library, and I think will be a really useful resource for my students in religion and medicine as you start to do your independent research projects. There's probably a lot of good chapters in there. And those of you who are in my religion medicine class read Dr. Stein's entry in that handbook today for class on energy healing. He's also the author of this book, Alternate Currents, Reiki Circulation in the 20th Century North Pacific, which we had an excellent conversation about earlier today with some faculty and students. It's been wonderful to have you on campus today, and I'm really looking forward to your talk. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zarla, for thank you all for being here, especially those of you who don't have to be here, but those of you who do have to be here too, I'm glad you made it. I'm going to talk for a little while, and then we'll hopefully have some time for Q&A. What time is it?
We have the room for 90 minutes.
Okay, that's what I thought. All right, great. So yeah, this is adapted from one thing that I published. It's a little bit based on that article from the Routledge volume, but it's also kind of moving in a new direction towards a future publication. And I'll also reference my book. Please send healing vibrations to the projector, which is having some technical difficulties. But yeah, so it's a little bit of a work in progress too. So I very much appreciate any questions, feedback on the presentation today. I was a philosophy major undergrad, but I came into university kind of as a science student and interested in science, and but then I started taking classes that were about like meaning, right? Not just like what is, but like, what do we make of it? And when I was originally applying for PhD programs, I wanted to do a really interdisciplinary project. I was going to combine historical work, social scientific work on the study of this energy healing stuff, as well as maybe looking at some of the biological research being done, the biomedical research, and maybe some of like the physics of energy, human energy fields and things like that. And I was basically told, like, you can't do that project. You have to pick a lane and stick in it. And I think that's kind of this tendency like that we have, right? This kind of idea of like, let's kind of divide up the world into different approaches, different types, ways of approaching things. And so, for example, the scientific and way of approaching the world versus humanities, right? The kind of empirical versus the more narrative, maybe we could say. The famous split between body and mind, right? Where we have certain doctors, certain specialists who help us with our physical ailments, and certain doctors, specialists who we turn to for our psychological, emotional kinds of issues. Another classic kind of divide, right? That between self and other, right? That we are different, we are separate from our environments, right? This kind of belief that we are an individual being, right? That is maybe sometimes trying to harmonize with, or sometimes in conflict with those around us, right? And trying to negotiate that boundary is at the heart of a lot of philosophy, and also obviously world events, politics, right? Thinking about tribalism, thinking about different ways where we have in-groups and and outgroups, right? Who belongs and who doesn't, who's included, who's excluded. And then also, right, turning my training, as Dr. Sterling said, in her training, and I think a number of the students and faculty here in the religious studies program, right, thinking about this world, right, the immanent, right, the everyday, the here and now, versus the transcendent, right, the eternal, this kind of true other world, divine world, right, the kind of mortal and transcendent worlds. At the same time, right, that there are these kinds of tendencies, maybe because there are these kinds of tendencies, there's also a tendency for the opposite, right? People who are trying to think about interrelations across category differences, right? There's a lot of talk in the academy, and maybe even some people trying to do this dangerous or difficult thing of interdisciplinarity, right? How do you apply insights from different perspectives? And religious studies kind of is founded a little bit on that idea, right? The kind of textual work, social scientific work, right? Bringing in history, trying to understand human relationships from a sociological or anthropological perspective, and maybe even some insights from science as well. A new field, I don't know how many people have heard of psychoneuroimmunology. It's a lot of fun to say, if you want to try. But it's basically the idea that our mind, our ideas, our feelings are interrelated with our nervous system, which is also interrelated with our immune responses, right? And so work on the so-called like placebo response, right? Placebo effect, how our beliefs actually affect the way that our bodies interact with different antigens, right? Different ways that people can heal, maybe based on whether the person who gave them the medicine was wearing a white coat or not, right? Research has shown that things like that actually impact healing outcomes. And then holobiomics, right? Have anyone heard of the holobiont, right? That your actual body has more bacterial cells in it than human cells, right? Than animal cells. So thinking of not that we are this individual, right? And that there is like other things in the world, but we are like ecosystems in a way, right? And your gut health, right? What kind of gut flora are living inside of you helps, again, shape your mental health, your digestion, right? Your emotional well-being, your resilience, right? That there's this kind of interaction that we are not just one thing maybe, but this interaction of a complex system, a kind of ecosystem. And Dr. Stein and I both work on East Asian religion, this kind of idea of non-duality at the heart of Mahayana Buddhism, right? That this kind of seeming, self and other, the samsara, right? The suffering of this world and the nirvana of escaping that really are parts of the same greater thing, and an idea that may be also not the same, but related to insights from other traditions, mystical traditions. I think some of you are in a class on mysticism as well, right? This idea maybe that there's all kind of oneness, right? That the seeming divide between the immanent and the transcendent is actually illusory, and that in every moment, right, there is a portal to the eternal, or something like that. Now, this binary is also kind of maybe splitting, right? That I mentioned like this. Sometimes they talk about like splitting and lumping, right? It's kind of two ways of doing it. There's a joke that there's two kinds of people in the world. Those who think there are two kinds of people in the world, and those who know better, right? And there's, it's kind of, I think this is a way of splitting that maybe not the most helpful way, but it's related to this theory that I'm going to be drawing on a little later in the talk. A theorist named Bruno Latour, French guy, science and technology studies, giant in that field, and his kind of maybe best known book, We've Never Been Modern, he talks about these different ways of approaching the world. And he talks about this work of purification, where we divide the world. The thing that he talks about a lot in the book is dividing the world into the human world and the non-human world, the world of culture and the world of nature. And what he suggests is that this is not a fact about the world, right? But it's a process, it's a human activity that divides the world into the human and the non-human, the nature and culture, and that's a kind of artifice, right? That's something that we do, and he calls that purification. But the way the world really is, he says, is a messy hybrid. I don't love the word because the word hybrid kind of implies that there are these pure things and they've been mixed, but that the world, he calls it the parliament of things, that there's like not this hard and fast separation between the human and the non-human. And he was writing, before this field of holobiomics I was just talking about, but I think that helps illustrate this, right? That we are not just human cells, right? We are this kind of emergent property from an interaction between our animal bodies and the microbes living inside of us in some ways. And so trying to do that messy work of figuring out these interactions in these hybrid assemblages or these networks, right? We're going to be talking about networks, is kind of the stuff I'm trying to do in my work. And so it's this work of interconnection and what he calls translation. Sorry. And we have these maps, right, that we use to make sense of the world. Language is a kind of map, in a sense, right? We have names for things. And Nietzsche had written that sometimes we act the way we act, even though we know better, but because we have this faith in grammar, right? That we don't actually live our lives according to our innermost beliefs necessarily, but because conventions, linguistic conventions, kind of are seductive and hypnotic and draw us back into this way of being, because, like, I am me, right? I have a name, right? I'm the same Justin that I was when I was 2 years old, right? So I have the same name as I did back then, right? There's this kind of assumption that identity persists over time, even though I know, right? I'm always changing, I'm always different, right? So there's this kind of way where like language can kind of pull us in, and for religious studies, one of the linguistic categories that we think about a lot is this idea of like, what is religion, right? And it sounds like there's a thing in the world called religion, and things are either religion or not religion, right? Because that's how language works, right? That's how logic works. It's A or not A, right? It can't be both. And what a lot of scholars in religious studies have done, the big turn, I think, in the last 30, 40 years of religious studies, has been to really move away from, okay, what is religion and what isn't religion, and looking instead at that activity, right? That purification, that way that people divide up the world into the religious and the secular. And there's a long colonial history there, right? That the term religion came about as European Christians were going around the world, looking at first maybe Jews and Muslims, right, in relation, and then idolaters, right, and everyone else. And then gradually thinking, okay, maybe indigenous people have their own religion, right? Maybe what is that, right? What is Hinduism, right? What is Buddhism, right? Coming up with these terms in order to understand others, right, in opposed to the colonial subject. And at the same time, right, what we've grown to understand is to say, oh, this is religious and that is secular, right, is a kind of claim about the world, right? When we talk about, religion and politics and thinking of them as two different spheres, right, and we kind of cover up a lot of the religious claims that underlie a lot of political activity. And the same thing could be said for economics, and same thing could be said for medicine. That's what I'm going to be focusing on in the talk today. And I'm going to be pointing out a lot of these kind of gray areas, right, where, is something religious or not, is a kind of anxiety that comes out when we look at these things that have some characteristics of what we might think of as religious, right, connecting to some superhuman power, maybe having ritual activities that are supposed to produce a change in the world, transform the world, connecting to this kind of ultimate ground of being, as it's been called. But at the same time, the people doing it are saying, this is not a religion, right? People from any religion can engage in this, right? Which may be familiar to many of you, right, as kind of this idea of like spirituality, right? That there's something that's accessible universally, even though it provides many of the same kind of ends that we've long kind of turned, that humans have long turned to religion for. There's kind of this claim, right, that you're able to kind of have the cake and eat it too, right? That I'm not religious, but I have all the same stuff, the good stuff, from religion, without all that kind of dogma and institutional, kind of baggage maybe. But again, right, making religion, choosing to do this kind of boundary work, right, where you're drawing a line and saying, this is religion and that is not religion. This is true religion, that is superstition, right? That's religion, but what I'm doing is spiritual, and it's okay to do in a secular world, is a contested political activity, right, with political consequences. And I'll give some examples of this later in the talk. So while maps, may not be territories, the activity of map making can redefine the contours of disputed ground, bequeathing rights to certain groups and denying them to others. And this contested work, its contested boundaries of religion and non-religion overlap with other social fields, I mentioned this, whose gatekeepers are also engaging in this kind of boundary work to negotiate what should be included and excluded. And so today, I'm going to address this boundary between religion and medicine by looking at this category of lived practice that troubles our ability to clearly distinguish between the two. And I call this category spiritual therapies, which I define as the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of illness. And illness here considered to be this holistic phenomenon, including but not limited to mind and body, through ritualized practices. And these practices are often understood by practitioners to be guided by one or more, what I call transpersonal intelligences. Right? So this could be God, this could be the universe, this could be the higher self, it could be different entities like angels or deities. And it's a very broad category on purpose. The exact borders can and maybe should be debated, but I am drawing them wide to include such things as meditation, yoga, and there's many types of these as well, right? So again, what does it fall in, does it fall in? It's boundary work. We can talk about it in the Q&A if you want. But things like Qigong, curandismo, the practices from Latin America, as well as indigenous ceremony, Afro-Caribbean ceremony, and healing prayer, including kind of Christian laying on of hands. And also Reiki, right, which I'm going to be talking about. This is the subject of my book. As I said, I'm not, some of the stuff we're going to talk about is in the book, but yeah, I'm also kind of moving in some other directions. So spiritual therapies exist in this uneasy relationship with both religion and medicine, presenting problems for secularist projects which conceive of religiosity as an easily recognizable attribute that can be segregated from ostensibly secular spaces, such as public hospitals, schools, or the halls of statecraft. Spiritual therapies, I argue, are one arena in which we can examine how difficult it can be to distinguish between attending to illness and attending to the soul. In order to consider what spiritual therapies can tell us about the relationship between religion and medicine in 21st century America, I will first introduce a specific variety of spiritual therapy, increasingly called energy healing, energy therapy, or energy medicine. Then I will examine how practitioners of Reiki, as well as Reiki's advocates and detractors, negotiate its religiosity to gain or deny access to hospital settings. And then I will reflect on the framework I present to make sense of how energy medicine and the lessons we learn from it can be applied to other spiritual therapies and draw some general conclusions before opening up to Q&A. But first I'm going to do a little boundary work of my own to specify how I'm using this term energy medicine, which in the field has been applied to like a very broad range of therapies. Since the late 1970s, medical researchers, healing practitioners, and holistic health advocates have used this term energy medicine to refer to a broad category of practices based on vitalistic conceptions of the human body as an energetic system, and of human health as a function of energetic circulation or resonance. These conceptions have been produced in explicit opposition to those of orthodox biomedicine, which these energy medicine advocates describe as, quote, physiochemical medicine. Since the late 1970s, virtually every variety of complementary and alternative medicine, or CAM, has been presented as a form of energy medicine, from acupuncture to homeopathy, from herbalism to magnetic therapies. Psychotherapists telling their clients to cultivate positive energy. Come back. Psychotherapists who tell their clients to cultivate positive energy call themselves energy workers, right, or energy therapists. Psychopomps working with spirit guides. In this sense, energy medicine is what we call like a floating signifier, meaning its vague definition allows it to mean whatever one likes. After all, as its promoters like to say, everything is energy. Proponents of energy medicine often describe the so-called energetic body as primary, so that when biomedical treatments of mental and physical illnesses only address symptom level, right, not the root energetic causes. A logic also common to many religious teachings about the relationship between the spiritual and the physical reality. And indeed, proponents of energy medicine often claim that spiritual knowledge and healing practices from around the world constitute a kind of proto-science on which their own work builds, verifying that ancient wisdom with modern scientific understandings and technological capabilities. My research suggests that the rise of energy medicine throughout the Anglophone world in the early 21st century was aided by the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine, or NCCAM, a division of the U.S. National Institutes of Health, which is now part of the U.S. Department of, which is part of the U.S. Department of Health and Health Services. NCCAM, founded in 1991 as the Office of Alternative Medicine, and renamed the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health in 2014, expanded greatly, as you can see on this map, I have a chart rather, I don't know if you can read the dates here, but this is like 2000 right here. So it greatly expanded under the direction of Dr. Stephen Strauss, and around the turn of the 21st century. And that's the time when NCCAM began including energy medicine as one of the so-called 5 branches of CAM in a schema that appeared on their website from 2002 to 2010. And so I don't know if people use the Wayback Machine, archive.org, just a brief shout out, great organization. Yeah, so if you ever want to find something that's not on the internet anymore, go to archive.org. And I'm not being paid for that. So yeah, you can see there's these kind of 5-fold thing, the last one of which is energy medicine, energy therapies, and then energy medicine, they divide into 2 different types of energy medicine. One using biofield therapies, which purportedly surround and penetrate the human body, because again, a lot of people talk about these biofields, but we don't actually measure like what is going on yet, right? We can measure electromagnetism, right? Like that's verifiable energy, right? But a lot of what energy workers, energy healers are using is something that we cannot actually detect with machines at this point, right? We don't know what is going on. And this is a reason why a lot of people reject energy medicine from kind of more empirical basis, saying there's no mechanism, verifiable mechanism for it, so any results that you're seeing, right, can't really be accepted by medical science, right? Because we don't have the pathway, we don't have the, yeah, okay. Okay, so the present day NCCIH, the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, now has reclassified these biofield therapies as a form of mind-body therapy, looking at it as kind of a psychosomatic thing rather than relying on these kind of putative energy fields. But present-day practitioners still cite this older, like, official recognition to establish the authority for their field. And these are a couple of older examples from the 2000s, which I know seems very old to some of the young people in the room, seems very recent to me. But these are some books about Reiki that talk about the NIH and NCCAM use of biofield therapies. This one is from a more recent, but still kind of ancient, right? It's like 13 years old now. Thing from Integrative Nursing Journal that also refers to the NCCAM biofield therapies kind of model up top. But similar moves to tie energy medicine's authority to its recognition by a center of the US Federal Health Agency continues to appear on dozens of websites, practitioners' websites, as well as present-day publications. In the last 10 years or so, this term, energy medicine, which gets used fairly interchangeably with energy healing or energy therapies, has come largely to refer to these biofield therapies, and these are some recent publications that illustrate that. So these refer to a group of therapies, including Reiki, therapeutic touch, healing touch, which those of you who read that article read, they kind of get into some of those. And they all purport to channel a form of universal life force energy that flows from the cosmos through the practitioner into the recipient to heal or to stimulate the recipient's natural ability to heal themselves. As these therapies can also be used on oneself, sometimes or often the practitioner and the recipient are the same person, right? So it's flowing from the cosmos into your hands, into you. And here's some illustrations. These therapies often employ a gentle touch, although they also claim to be effective if the hands are held slightly above the body in the patient's so-called aura. And they also include distant treatments for recipients who are not physically co-present. These therapies are probably most commonly practiced informally without cash payment in private settings, among family and friends, or self-treatment. But they are also performed professionally in a fee-for-service model in clinics and spas resembling those of the massage industry, and in biomedical settings, often as part of a volunteer program, but sometimes by nurses and other medical professionals. And there's even a project at St. George's Hospital, London, in the UK, where professional Reiki practitioners paid from a private fund work as part of integrative medical teams in wards throughout the hospital, including pediatrics, oncology, and infectious disease. And those practitioners undergo like a 6-month training to be part of that program. And it's pretty remarkable in some ways, in many ways. Okay. Modern energy medicine practices resemble earlier forms of religious healing by the laying on of hands, application of the breath to also push, transmit the healing energy, and empowerment of objects. There's also belief that there's this force that pervades existence, particularly living things, that the circulation or distribution of this force regulates health. So when disease is the result of the stagnation, deficiency, or imbalance of this force, that humans, through our natural aptitude, intuition, and or practice, are able to perceive this force and channel it to promote healing in themselves and in others, and that healing with this force is inseparable from mastering the self. That is, it's a kind of moral or spiritual development. It goes hand in hand with the practice. So these are ways where the modern energy medicine kind of resemble earlier forms of religious healing. I also point out these kind of 3 ways where it differs. So modern energy medicine, tends to claim that spiritual adepts around the world have used this force to heal since ancient times, and it's the same force has been known by various cultures around the world under various names, such as Pneuma, Spiritus, Prana, Chi, Mana. Second, the force underlying these ancient modes of healing may not be directly detectable by present-day scientific instruments, but the energy does follow scientific principles and will soon be technologically measurable. They've been saying this for about a century now, at least in the Reiki world. And third, this healing is spiritual but not religious, and thus is appropriate for practice by individuals of any religious background or no religious background, in religious spaces or in secular spaces, from churches to hospitals. And so these are kind of modern energy medicine attributes that I identify. Regarding this last point, that you can do this anywhere, right? You can do it in a church, you can do it in a public school, it's fine, it's not religious. If you look on Wikipedia and you look up spiritual healing, it redirects you to energy medicine. And Wikipedia, right, is one of the chief, when you want to know something today, right, it's like one of the chief sites for knowledge production and also knowledge contestation, right, that anyone has ever clicked on the like view history tab here, where you see like the flame wars between editors and people trying to change the page. And yeah, if you do that for this page, there's been a number of back and forths about whether to redirect spiritual healing to energy medicine or to another page on faith healing. And the resolution of this disagreement seems to be linked to the statement in the introduction, I think I have it in the next slide, that spiritual healing is a school of energy healing distinct from faith healing, because faith healing takes place within a traditional religious context. And spiritual healing occurs largely in non-denominational and ecumenical contexts in which practitioners do not see traditional religious faith as a prerequisite for effecting cures. And so again, this kind of religious making on Wikipedia, right? This distinguishing between faith healing from energy, from spiritual healing, and spiritual healing then being making a subcategory of energy medicine. Here's this trait that I point out as broadly characteristic of contemporary energy medicine, namely this distinction from so-called traditional religion and the association from the association with a non-denominational spirituality, which permits it a kind of mobility into secularized spaces where practices marked as religious might be unwelcome. However, I will also provide counterexamples of later of energy healing's like religification in the following section on strategic framings. One more point about this Wikipedia page, you may see it is part of a series on alternative and pseudo-medicine, as well as fringe medicine and science, alongside things like acupressure, acupuncture, aromatherapy. Basically any form of CAM is considered to be this kind of fringe science and medicine. And this illustrates the tense negotiations in the presentation of information about energy medicine, while searches online and in libraries and databases turn up a mix of materials from believers and from skeptics, professional practitioners, and practiced debunkers of what they deride as woo, short for woo-woo. While energy medicine has attracted prominent advocates, including Dr. Mehmet Oz, whose wife is a Reiki master, and also Dr. Oz's former colleague at New York Presbyterian Columbia Hospital in New York, Dr. Sheldon Mark Feldman, who's chief of the breast surgery division and also president of the American Society of Breast Surgeons, Dr. Robert Schiller, chair of family medicine at New York's Mount Sinai Beth Israel. Reiki's detractors, or energy medicine's detractors, also include prominent medical doctors and researchers who attack research into energy medicine and other so-called fringe or pseudo-medical practices as a waste of resources better spent on biomedical research. They criticize the inclusion of so-called energy medicine into biomedical centers as strengthening its authority for mainstream audiences despite unproven efficacy and unknown mechanisms. A little sip of water here. Due to these threats by gatekeepers of American medicine, and also due to the sometimes uncertain legal status of spiritual therapies, practitioners of energy medicine engage in a variety of discursive strategies to legitimize their practices vis-a-vis the discursive categories of religion and medicine. To be clear, these strategies are not mutually exclusive, but they are often applied to the same practice, even used by the same individual, to appeal to different audiences or to gain access to different sites. To illustrate that, I'll use the example of Hawayo Takada, the Hawaii-born Japanese-American woman who made use of all three of these strategies as she brought Reiki from Japan to North America, which is the subject of my book. So this is like the book part of the talk. And I say Takada even though the Japanese pronunciation is Takata, because she's Japanese-American and that's how she and her students pronounce it. Okay, just kind of a little bit on what is Reiki, because I think some people are more familiar than others. And so, yeah, Reiki with a capital R is the practice. And it's not just a practice, it's like a whole set of practices. And there's a lot of different forms of Reiki out there. But in general, Reiki is said to promote physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being through this power, also called Reiki, which I put in lowercase and italics to distinguish the power from the practice. Literally, maybe spiritual key or marvelous key. Hawaii Takata chose to translate Reiki as universal life energy, and this is how it's typically translated today. So Reiki practitioners, promoters say that all living things use Reiki to heal, that it's just kind of a natural ability of living things, but humans, as the spiritual heads, the Reicho of humanity, Bambutsu no Reicho, that they can channel Reiki in a kind of more sophisticated way to heal themselves and heal others. And the particular, like, capital R Reiki is an abbreviation of an earlier kind of Japanese name for this practice called Usui Reiki Ryoho, named after the founder, Mikao Usui, who it is said had this kind of miraculous experience on a mountaintop where he received this healing power, and he developed this system in order to initiate other people to be able to channel it. So again, it's this kind of natural ability, but that the practitioners can kind of have their natural abilities enhanced, strengthened by receiving these initiations from an instructor, and they can deepen their capacity to channel Reiki through regular practice. Basic practices of Reiki involve hands, breath, visualization. There are these 5 kind of moral ideals in a way to promote your spiritual development. And then advanced practices, so if you get the next level of initiation, you learn to do these distance treatments, as well as using these kind of secret symbols that you're not supposed to, or sacred symbols, they prefer, sacred symbols that you're not supposed to show people unless they've received that level of initiation. So it's kind of esoteric logic here. And yeah, through the life work of Hawaii Takata, who brought Reiki from Japan to Hawaii and North America, it became this global practice, and she adapted its practices for North American audiences, including these kind of strategies that I'll talk about now to negotiate Reiki status vis-a-vis religious and medical authorities. So the first and the most common of these 3 strategies is to engage in the discourse of being spiritual but not religious, or SBNR, as it's sometimes called. So as with many practitioners of meditation or yoga, practitioners of Reiki, therapeutic touch, healing touch often make this claim that their practice is not a religion but a spiritual practice. This distinction assumes that spirituality is a quality that is unproblematically separable from a category of human activity called religion. In contrast to religions, which are considered to be particularist and exclusivist, requiring conversion and prohibiting multiple belonging, spirituality is often conceived as being universal and non-exclusivist, appealing to audiences with prior religious commitments, as well as those who are wary of organized religion, but open to or interested in spirituality. As with programs designed to teach yoga or mindfulness in public schools, being SBNR can also provide access to secularized spaces where religious practice is excluded or regulated. However, this SBNR strategy provides uncertain legal protection for these practices. In a 2013 ruling, the Fourth Circuit Court denied a Virginia spiritual healer's claim that a county ordinance that fortune tellers register with local police and pay for a license violated her First Amendment right to the free exercise of religion. The court cited the 1976 Supreme Court case of Wisconsin v. Yoder, ruling that the plaintiff's spiritual beliefs were a way of life, akin to Thoreau's transcendentalism, rather than, quote, deep religious convictions shared by an organized group deserving of constitutional solicitude. So thus, a second strategy taken by energy medicine practitioners is to align themselves with a religious institution, which can provide legal protection or other types of authority. Right? Spirituality doesn't cut it for constitutional law, so let's represent a real religion, right? However, this kind of this here is kind of a case where Reiki is seen as insufficiently religious. This is a 2009 document called the Guidelines for Evaluating Reiki as an Alternative Therapy. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops recommended that Catholic retreat centers and Catholic hospitals, which had seen a rise of Reiki workshops and practice in the late 1990s, prohibit Reiki from their spaces, as it was in a gray zone that was neither properly religious nor properly medical. In response to the exclusion of SBNR practitioners from spaces where religious practitioners are allowed access, like chaplains in hospitals or things like that, or out of fear that they could be prosecuted from laying on of hands without having some kind of license, thousands of energy medicine practitioners have ordained as religious clergy, most commonly through the Universal Life Church, an institution best known for ordaining anyone for free online, which is often used by individuals to obtain ministerial status to perform weddings. However, in an open letter to regarding the large numbers of Reiki practitioners ordaining as ULC ministers for legal protection, a former director of a ULC splinter group expressed concerns that he was unsure whether it would hold up in court, and to my knowledge, it's never been tested. We'll see. Stay tuned. Watch the space. Okay. Conversely, religious organizations that do not have their own healing practices have picked up energy healing as a means of supplementing their own teachers for members. You can see here from the Universal Life Church website that they presently advertise Reiki to its own ministers as a healing tool. This practice was pioneered over 40 years ago by metaphysical Christian organizations in the US, such as the Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship in the Chicago area and the Universal Church of the Master in the San Francisco Bay Area, which were among the most important sponsors of Reiki courses in the mid to late 1970s. A more recent example that I mentioned in the chapter that some of you read is from the Healing Touch Spiritual Ministry. So it's another energy medicine modality. And this ministry started in the late 1990s due to demands by students of Healing Touch who wanted workshops on how to integrate their practice with their Christianity. And so the founder of Healing Touch, Janet Menken, asked one of her students to develop a curriculum for, quote, a Christian approach to energy healing based on the laying on of hands to help those who had problems with a language they deemed too new age. And this program, which she called the Healing Touch Spiritual Ministry, began offering certifications. And by the early 2000s, mainline Protestant churches interested in healing by laying on of hands, but they didn't have the kinds of developed practices common in evangelical churches or charismatic churches, began sponsoring Healing Touch spiritual ministry courses for their congregants to learn Healing Touch, which then they could practice in the churches. Third legitimation strategy used by energy healers is medicalization of their practices. That is, the emphasis of their therapeutic aspects and the minimization of their spiritual or religious aspects. The very term energy medicine that I've been focusing on in this presentation is a form of the strategy, but it can also take the form of receiving some sort of licensure, most commonly a form of massage therapy, to be able to legally place hands on patients. This is particularly common in Florida, Dr. Sterling's home state, because state law there recognizes Reiki and similar treatments as forms of massage, which requires licensure. Having some kind of medical license, whether massage, chiropractic, naturopathy, not only provides discursive authority and legal protection, but it can also help patients claim energy services for insurance reimbursements, which can be an incentive for some clients. While this strategy may provide the most legal protection, it also requires the greatest investment in resources, namely the time and money required to become a licensed professional. As I mentioned, these three modes of strategic framing are not exclusive to one another and are sometimes used by the same individual to appeal to different audiences or gain access to different sites. And I have an example from Hawaii Takada's story, but I think I am running a little low on time, so I may just skip ahead. And if anyone wants to ask in the Q&A, if you want to hear a story, I got a story for you. Okay. So let's go up to the title of the talk. Okay. Hey, but it's good. No. I don't know. Anyway, we'll see. I want to make sure we have time to do it. And I've been talking for a long time. Okay. So as we've seen, practitioners of and advocates for spiritual therapies use different types of strategies to locate their practices vis-a-vis the social fields of religion and medicine. We also know religion and medicine are themselves discursive fields, right, whose contested identities are produced and maintained through boundary work by gatekeepers who distinguish religion from categories of non-religion, like the secular or superstition, and gatekeepers of medicine who distinguish proper medicine from quackery or woo. As I mentioned earlier, the scholar of science and technology studies, Bruno Latour, calls this kind of boundary work purification, and argues that while purification can be somewhat unavoidable at the level of discursive abstraction, what really exists in the world are these kind of hybrid forms. And so when you think something is pure, there's probably some unexamined assumptions underlying that kind of purity. And so now I'm going to try to shift into this work of translation, study these messy hybrids that exist at the level of lived reality, and try to explain how promoters of what I call spiritual therapies make sense of their own practices in relation to these categories of religion and medicine. So, many practitioners of these therapies subsume their practice within one of these categories, as they view the other one as something distinct from what they do. Right? So, for example, many who identify as Christian might be comfortable describing their healing practice as religious, but not as medical. Right? As they define medicine as something scientific and secular. Others, maybe who have antipathy towards religion, possibly, might be comfortable talking about their practices as forms of complementary and alternative medicine, right, as opposed to religious. Right? That this is not a religion, it's nothing to do with religion. They usually see religion as overly dogmatic and exclusionary, where they say energy medicine is open to all, regardless of religious commitment. A secondary strategy is to put spiritual therapies outside of both religion and medicine. And we saw this in the statement by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, who recommended Reiki be prohibited from Catholic spaces because it's neither healing by divine grace nor healing that utilizes the powers of nature. A third discourse, which is used, I would say, by some maybe like indigenous healers, identify their practice at the intersection of both religion and medicine. Right? That medicine doesn't mean it's separate from religion. Right? That there's this kind of sense that you can have spiritual medicine. Right? You have your religious practices can be called medicine. Right? And your medicine can be also your religion. Right? That they're not necessarily exclusive, but that there's this artificial separation, right? This purification. And this third discursive strategy gestures toward this fact that the categories of religion and medicine, while ostensibly separate, in fact share a long history, where healing of body and healing of spirit were attended to by the same specialists in the same institutions. As practitioners themselves gesture toward this, I want to explore this kind of fourth possibility that builds on, but I think differs from, as well, this kind of intersection model that I think is also helpful for thinking through other cases as well. And I call this the recuperative middle. And this is what I'm still working on, so I definitely invite feedback. But this is the framing of spiritual therapies as a kind of unjustly rejected knowledge that can complement the shortcomings of both institutional religion and physicalist medicine. And actually, I have another Takata story here, so you're still getting some. Okay. So Hawaii Takata used storytelling as a primary means of communicating her ideas to clients and students. And there's one story that she often told, and that particularly clarifies this recuperative vision of the relationship she saw between Reiki, religion, and medicine. So in 1954, she said, in one recorded telling of the story, a wealthy Honolulu acquaintance arranged a forum between her and the president of the American Medical Association, who was living in Hawaii. And it seems that this esteemed physician had heard about Reiki and became interested in meeting Takata. So her friend arranged for the three of them to have dinner at the fancy Royal Hawaiian Hotel where he lived. Oh, sorry, where her friend lived. And afterwards, they retired to the friend's suite. And Takata was shocked to find 43 of her students assembled on the carpet, sitting, waiting for them to come for this showdown. And they wanted to be there to provide moral support. So before this assembled audience, she said, she calmly answered the doctor's many questions. She said, for what felt like a couple of hours. But much like me, when they checked the clock, it was much later than she thought. It was 1:30 in the morning. And again, shocked, she tried to excuse herself. But the doctor said he wanted to ask two final questions. So first, he said, do you think all of the medical doctors in Honolulu should learn Reiki? She replied, yes, doctor, and not only the doctors, but also the ministers. And he said, why the ministers? Takata replied, Doctor, I should be very, very happy if all the MDs understood Reiki and took Reiki and used it to add to their profession. It would be a great service for mankind and for the community. On the other hand, if the ministers did Monday to Friday, Reiki, Reiki, and helped all the members of the church who were seeking better health, better mental attitudes, then with the Sunday services, you could make them a complete whole. Takata said that the doctor was silent for a number of seconds, and then he rushed her and furiously started energetically shaking her hand, saying, "You have said the truth. This is absolutely the truth." He then asked Takata his second question, which was whether she could find the location of his backaches, which she quickly did by feeling vibrations with her hand. He asked how to treat it, and she said it's a chronic condition, so you need to have regular treatments, and so it's better for your wife to learn it so she could treat you every night. She was willing, so Takata told her, organize a group of your friends and I'll teach a class, this is how she does it. Okay. And she said, though, that based on the doctor's experiences with Reiki, he made a proclamation that from that day on, Reiki could be practiced at any hospital in Hawaii. In the story, Takata makes the most of this kind of showdown, right, with the AMA president, in a way that resembles, but distinct from, narratives of other spiritual therapists in the post-war US who told of winning over physicians with their power to heal. Like stories told by Oral Roberts, Paramahamsa Yogananda, and many others at the time, these healing demonstrations convince medical authorities, medical physicians, of the efficacy of their treatment. And this element is clearly meant to win over the listener to the story to be open to the treatment as well. It's an imperative model. However, Takata's narrative differs from these narratives by figures like Roberts and Yogananda in that the doctor first recognizes her and Reiki's importance based on her response to his first question, where she affirmed that Reiki not only fulfills an element missing from biomedicine, but also an element missing from religion. Thus, the vision of spiritual therapy in the story, which Takata related to clients and students for decades, is a bit different, I think, from the strategies of subsumption, differentiation, and intersection that I described earlier, because she sees Reiki as fulfilling an essential but missing component of both religion and medicine. Two spheres of activity generally considered separate in the post-war US, and this strategy allows Reiki to mediate between the purely physical medicine and the purely spiritual religion, completing them both by allowing them to tend to the body, mind, and spirit, so-called body, mind, and spirit of their practitioners and parishioners. Okay. There's a lot of other literature on this, and I think that this insight is a contribution to this literature. Others have recognized that these therapies are kind of laicized, secularized, scientized, medicalized, commodified versions of older religious traditions, and as I mentioned, right, kind of reframing spiritual healing as energy medicine is itself a kind of strategic reframing. However, in contrast to some of those earlier scholars' concerns that use of sacred technologies for this worldly concerns is a corruptive trend, practitioners themselves do not necessarily see the contradictions between the medicalized and the secularized framing of their practice, right? And that's that recuperated middle. Okay, so in my conclusion, some of you I'm sure are relieved to hear those words. I want to turn to two contemporary trends going on in the world of energy medicine that provide food for thought regarding the future for spiritual therapies in America. The first is a movement by some energy healers seeking greater legal protection for their practice, who have come together with other groups who share similar interests to lobby state houses for these so-called health freedom laws. Some of you have maybe become aware of these groups during the COVID pandemic, when the anti-vaccine activists joined forces with kind of other camp practitioners such as like homeopaths. This goes back to at least the early 21st century. And they use these precedents in state law that were originally created for practitioners of Christian Science, which itself is an interesting precedent for practices that self-consciously draw on scientific, medical, and religious discourse. But yeah, this National Health Freedom Coalition is currently working to create exceptions for healing by spiritual means in state medical licensure laws. They list on their website these 11 safe harbor states, most recently Nevada and Maine, joining, where they've had this success passing state laws protecting spiritual healing as an exempt from needing medical licensure. So this, kind of shows that while some kind of play down the spiritual side of their practice to gain access to secularized spaces, there are ways where spiritualized framings may provide certain access and protection as well. Yet at the same time, 21st century spiritual therapists are simultaneously reframing their practices in scientized and medicalized ways. If you look, this is a Google Ngram search, which also might be a useful tool for people looking for trends. I mean, it's got issues as well as a method, but you can see these are basically looking for English language books with these terms, and spiritual healing seems to be a bit on the decline in the 21st century, while terms like energy healing and energy medicine are on the rise. So it might be too early to jump to any big conclusions about this apparent trend, but it may be a response to medical gatekeepers wary of woo, violating their own sacred thresholds, contaminating the halls of medicine with what they consider to be unscientific superstition. Okay, I'll really wrap it up. I've been talking for too long. So in conclusion, while practitioners and advocates for spiritual therapies use a variety of strategies in their discursive framing, both religious authority and medical authority are crucial for their appeal to different audiences and to their legal status in the US. The example of energy medicine I talked about today is but one example, and I argue that this kind of category of spiritual therapy more broadly illustrates how religion and medicine can be purified into distinct categories on an abstract level, but in lived practice, they exist in this kind of messy Latourian hybrid. Finally, the slippery quality called spirituality, which exists in tensions with both the categories of religion and non-religion, can be both boon and burden to access to various medical sites, as spiritual but not religious practices continue to occupy a position of indistinct legal protection in the US when compared to religious practices, and as gatekeepers alternately perceive spiritual practices as either excessively or insufficiently religious. So thanks all for your attention. Talk for too long, but yeah, I'm very open to
We have, we've got a good 25, 30 minutes that we can do Q&A. If anybody needs to get out of here and wants to make a graceful exit, this would be a good time to do that. Otherwise, raise your hand if you have a question for Justin. I see Michelle over there.
Possibly clarify a little bit the distinction between the intersection category versus the recuperative middle?
Yeah.
Because they seem a little similar.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure on the distinction.
Yeah, so I think that's a really question. I think that there are times where groups don't want to give up the category of religion. So I think a good example is with indigenous groups in North America who want constitutional protection for their practices, claiming this is religion and it's medicine does something a little different than what I think the Reiki people want to do. Where, there's a great book, Tisa Wanger's We Have a Religion, I think shows that very well, where a particular indigenous practice that had been, at some point under, I think, the Spanish colonial rule, it was deemed as cultural, because that way the Catholic Church wouldn't wipe it out, right? If it was religious, the Catholic Church would say it was demonic and they needed to get rid of it. But because it was cultural, it was okay. But then, as the Southwest moved from Mexican rule to American rule, all of a sudden, to just be cultural wasn't sufficient to give it constitutional protection. And so that's just like one example that comes to mind. But I think that for indigenous ceremony, and again, there's different actors within different indigenous groups. Some want to claim the religious title. Others are more maybe comfortable with talking about indigenous spirituality. And there's also Christian indigenous people out there too who want to say, yeah, this is my culture, this is my cultural heritage, but my religion is Christianity, right? So there's, obviously it's a complex field with different actors, but I think that's one way where like this idea of the recuperative middle is like a little different from that intersection idea. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Well, thank you for talking and vetting all that.
Anytime.
To come more often. But when you're talking about the legitimatization practices, do you think that by doing these through Western standards, it's like kind of taking away from the original practice and is it really essential to legitimatize it through Western gaze?
That's a really interesting question. I think similar, I've written another article kind of on this subject, but similar issues were at work in 1920s Japan when it was, in 1920s Japan when it was developed, and then into the 1930s as kind of like different crackdowns by the Japanese government against new religious movements were happening. And so the category of religion and what to make of these like spiritual therapies at that time in Japan, I think was a concern 100 years ago in Japan as well. And so I just think that the stakes and the strategies do change based on context and like legal issues and also like differences in discourse. That like they wanted to say at that time that Reiki is not a religion, but they also drew on some like religious vocabulary in describing it. So yeah, I think there's similarities and differences in different contexts. But yeah, did that sufficiently answer? Was there something like the thing about the Western gaze that's super interesting, because that's also, I think there's this like spiritualization of the Orient, right? And this idea that like you can appropriate practices from, or there's like kind of this like neo-colonial thing in some aspects of how Asian religious practices are taken up overseas. And so, there's this question of like who's authorized to practice, but at the same time, like things like Reiki were like self-consciously designed for the people, right? It wasn't supposed to be a kind of practice where you need to dedicate yourself to a monastic life or anything like that. Maybe as opposed to maybe some meditation practices, or thinking about the secularization of mindfulness or something like that. But again, the architects of things like the Vipassana movement or some of the forms of Zazen that have Zen meditation that have circulated, we're also kind of laicizing, democratizing the practice and trying to make it so lay people, ordinary people could do it. And so, yeah, on the one hand, who's authorized to do it? On the other hand, who's authorized to prohibit people from doing it, right? And I think that certainly there's like early discourse that like, Reiki is for the people of the world, that Usui in his great compassion for humanity wanted to teach the people Reiki. And so to say, oh, if you're not Japanese, you can't do Reiki, like I don't think that's like, on one hand, that's maybe a little in tension with some of the early stuff. But there is an example in the book where Takada wants to study Reiki, and her teacher says no because she's American. And she's Japanese American, but he says, and it's not entirely clear why, but part of it I think is that she asks a lot of questions, and there's like this story she tells where her teacher Hayashi says, we gave the world karate, we gave the world tea ceremony, we gave the world, ikebana, flower arranging, all these things, but Reiki is not for the world. Reiki is for the Japanese people or something like that. And she has to get, actually a doctor, to write her this letter of reference. He hand writes this kind of calligraphic scroll letter, and then he agrees to teach her. And this lady, who also is part of the thing, tells Takada, she says, don't ask sensei all these questions. If you want to ask questions, you ask me later. But when we're in the meeting, like you basically like, you're too loud, like don't like stop, like just sit and learn. And if you have questions, ask me later. So I don't know exactly and again, she told this story like 45 years later, like after the fact. And so like how much of it is her own, trying to teach some lessons to her students, and who knows, but like, what really happened in 1935 in Tokyo, I don't know, but this is the stories that she passed down in her oral tradition, yeah.
I guess a follow-up question to that then, do you think that traditional Japanese Reiki masters would then oppose these practices because it is saying, okay, if you're going to if you're going to say it's a religion that's hypocritical, if you're saying that it's spiritual but not religious, so then by doing these legitimatizing practices, isn't that just taking away its essence?
So by saying like, oh, Christian Reiki, for example, or?
Well, saying, okay, this is a medical practice, this is a religious practice, does that take away from what it is at its core?
Yeah, I mean, I think the religious practice probably bothers people more, because like there is such a kind of slogan, like Reiki is not a religion, but at the same time, I think even the people incorporating into religion and saying, like, I'm a minister of this church, and I do Reiki as a means to channel the Holy Spirit, and we in our church, like, we believe in this, but we don't have a system to kind of initiate people into a healing ministry, right? Do I think that there are Reiki people who would be critical of that? Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a million Reiki people, like, someone's going to be critical of everything, but I think for most Reiki people, they're tired of being attacked by Christians, and so I think when Christians want to get on board with Reiki, I think in general, people are like, great, but yeah, I think that there probably are some people who think it's a misuse or an appropriation or something, yeah, but yeah, thank you for the questions. Here and then, yeah.
What do you know, or is there information about Reiki's existence in Japan before? I'm sorry, I forgot her name.
Takata?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's chapter 2. And yes, I've done a lot of work. That's what a lot of people have been interested in, because there's been a lot of criticism of Takata over the years in Reiki circles, saying, she westernized the practice, and it's not the true, traditional, original, authentic practice as taught by Usui. And so there's been a lot of lineages trying to recover that, like, early, and in today around the world, there are basically, if you want to split, Reiki into two things, there's like so-called traditional Japanese Reiki, and then so-called like Western Reiki or Takata Reiki or something like that. And so yeah, we don't know everything, but we have learned a lot. I've done a lot of work on it. I can give some like major differences if you're interested. I don't know.
I'm definitely interested.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the big things that Takata changed is she changed it from what I call like a group membership model, where you have to regularly attend meetings, kind of like the way like martial arts training is, where you go to meetings regularly and your teacher supervises your progress through the various levels and kind of maybe gives like practical examinations and determines when you're ready to move on to the next level. And at those meetings, you regularly receive these like empowerment ceremonies, and they are thought to kind of strengthen your connection to the cosmic source of Reiki. In what happened during World War II, Takata basically suspended that model because as a Japanese American teaching in Hawaii, right, just having gatherings, particularly to do something like spiritual or religious, was very suspect, could get you incarcerated. In Hawaii, Japanese Americans, only about 1% of Japanese Americans were incarcerated, as opposed to on the mainland where all, basically, Japanese Americans in the Western US were incarcerated. Part of that's because a third of Hawaii at the time was Japanese American, and so it would just like collapse the society if you put a third of the people in prison. But yeah, so anyway, the people who went were often like religious leaders, community leaders, and so she suspended that model during the war, but then she never reinstated it after. And so she moved to what I call like the certified licensure, like certified practitioner model, where you take your course, you get a certificate, and go off into the world and practice. And I think that's really what allowed Reiki to spread around the world, right? Because if you have to go to a meeting every week, it's much harder to set up a local chapter in a city and have people regularly coming to meetings rather than being a traveling teacher who can teach a class and then eventually maybe come back once a year or something, and eventually your students move up from level 1 to level 2 to become maybe Reiki masters themselves. So that's I would say the biggest adaptation she made. And I was mentioning this to some people earlier, that in Tokyo today, I know someone who teaches both like so-called traditional Japanese Reiki and so-called Western Reiki, and he said he gets so many more people wanting to learn Western Reiki, in part maybe because it's just like, yeah, you take a course, you get your certificate, and you can go off and practice. Like it's much simpler in some ways. And of course, there's people from both sides who are critics, but I have to say, I also know the president of like the most traditional Japanese Reiki society in the world told me, he's like, yeah, it's really great that you all can like teach people like in this like very systematic way, because for us, like, it's really like, difficult to like, how do you teach like a thing that's like so intangible and amorphous and like it's like a struggle for their society is like, how are you a good Reiki teacher? Like, what does that actually look like? So they are like, both sides I think are envious of the other in some ways. Yeah. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, I'm curious if like in writing and kind of researching for this book, if you ever yourself utilized the 3 strategies that you described
Oh yeah.
to like navigate kind of the boundaries and positioning yourself.
That's really interesting. I could give an example also that I mentioned in the Q&A, but it's a different framing now. So I went for a job interview for a Department of Religion job, and I was basically grilled by the chair of the department in the job interview, like, so does Reiki work? And I was like, well, if I was here like as a scholar of Christian history, would you ask me if angels are real? And I think that's kind of a religification strategy, right? To say, Reiki is a practice deserving of respect like any other religious practice or something like that. That's one that comes to mind. I mean, certainly the idea that like Reiki is not a religion, so I definitely, in my work, have tried to look at ways where people with strong Buddhist commitments, strong Christian commitments, have incorporated Reiki into their religious lives. And so in a way, maybe that is like a spiritualization of Reiki, like spiritual but not religious, that like, it's something that like, and I'm not like criticizing it, right? I'm just trying to understand how people are doing their thing. So maybe in that like non-judgmental kind of scholarly framework, there is like a kind of a tacit celebration of that idea that like secularized practices are adaptable into different religious. I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I'm really trying to be like, yeah, like everybody should be doing it. I really also try to avoid that in my work, but maybe there is kind of like a little bit of a tacit like liberal understanding of spirituality as able to be adapted to different religious settings. And do I medicalize Reiki? Yeah, I mean, I look at Reiki in medical settings. Again, I do try to like avoid in my work being like, yeah, these programs are great, and like more hospitals should have them, but like maybe like my work can get cited as like an example, like, oh look, this scholar is documenting Reiki in medicine, so therefore like let's cite that as something to promote Reiki in medicine. Like I think, yeah, again, I don't think I'm like self-consciously trying to do any of those, but like that's the tricky stuff, right? Is there's always under the surface, we internalize these different discursive strategies, I think, in different ways. So yeah, I think just turn it off. Sorry, Michelle, were you, anyone else want to, I'll come back. Okay.
I guess this is less of a question but more of a wondering, since like of the esoteric nature of like original Reiki teachings and like kind of initiation and then getting the secret knowledge. I wonder if like
I'm not telling, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I know you probably can't. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, but I wonder sometimes if like there's something that might be lost down the line through the like open accessibility.
Yeah.
Of Reiki and, like,
Yeah, I think there's a lot of anxiety about that.
Yeah.
I think there's something that happens when like Reiki masters from different lineages get together and they're like, hey, how do you do initiation? Because like everyone I think is a little bit worried that their teacher maybe didn't get the full thing, and like it's this like kind of taboo topic. But yeah, I think there is anxiety about that. And there's certainly like people who've published like they publish the secrets. And the books are very different. For like the procedures in the books differ a lot from each other. So there definitely is variation that happens, like a game of telephone. But at the same time, like I think other Reiki people are like, you know what? It all works. It doesn't matter what lineage you're from. Like, yeah, sure, they might do it a little different. We do a little bit of it. If you get on the table and they put your hands on you, like that's the proof's in the pudding kind of thing, right? And like, yeah, so maybe, I don't know, maybe there's like, I mean, it's just speculation, but like, maybe I think one logic is like there's maybe like fail safes built into the system that you don't need every single one of these things. I don't know, but like, it seems that like people, even though I think a lot of people are very concerned with like doing the ritual properly, which you see in like all these different traditions as well, maybe there are also people I think have trust that like, it's not me doing it, it's the universe working through me, it's the Reiki is taking care of things, and so maybe if you are just doing it the way your teacher taught you, and you have good intentions, and you're really trying your best, that like maybe you don't need to worry about all the little technical doodads. But there's a lot of people who worry about the technical doodads and criticize other lineages as not having the right teaching or things like that. That's definitely out there.
Yeah, maybe this is like a wrong sort of view of it, but I almost I wonder if there's like a different like kind of almost artistic take through like different traditional Reiki teachings.
So that's a whole other
Like,
kind
a
of,
little different.
yeah, no, I think there's like traditionalists who are purists and they want to say, I want to do it exactly the way that my teacher taught me, and changing anything would be disrespect to the lineage. And there are other people who are like, oh yeah, I'm going to incorporate crystals, I'm going to incorporate angels, I'm going to, so this kind of like eclectic approach is also very common. And it's part of why we have so many diverse lineages today. So yeah, after Takata is when things get real complicated, and that's why, part of why my book basically ends in 1980, because I don't want to deal with all the 80s and the 90s when things start getting real messy. Let someone else deal with that stuff. There's another question. Maybe I can show some more slides. The slides that's good. Yeah, please.
I
Yeah.
have one very silly question. Before coming to here, I was working at home, and then when I'm working, I always play something from YouTube, and then I was spontaneously like Google and search it like Reiki, and then there were so many Reiki ASMR stuff.
Oh yeah.
There's like a lady like play with your hands and then like whispering, but like how the community Reiki community or like or practitioners are how do they like take this kind of new trend
Yeah.
on YouTube? I don't know.
I think, again, it's a diverse community, different
Yeah.
people probably have different perspectives on it, but yeah, so I think these types of videos, the practitioner might, like ding a little bell, like light a little sage, like smudge the camera phone or whatever, and then, might be doing like a treatment into their, like iPhone or whatever, and then the idea is if you play it on your iPhone, that you're gonna receive some of that healing energy. I think there's probably people who think it is cuckoo, and I think there's probably people who think, yeah, why not? Like, Reiki is just vibrations, it's energy. What's coming through your phone is energy, right? So why not be able to send Reiki through YouTube? But at the same time, I put on some of those before and just laid down and had it playing and it feels nice. I don't know. Again, the problem is we can't measure Reiki, right? It's all subjective kind of experience, and so. I don't know. I'm not sure. But there's definitely there's also websites where don't pay a Reiki teacher, you'll get a free initiation through this website. Just self-initiate, just follow these steps and then, put your hands in prayer position and click on the thing and the initiation is gonna come through your computer screen and send me $20 if you want, or not, buy me a coffee, whatever, but yeah, I don't know. Again, I think there's a lot of mixed feelings in the Reiki world about that as well. Yeah. More negative than positive. I think people are more probably lenient on the ASMR people than the initiate yourself at home computer people. Yeah.
Just from the perspective of my religion and medicine class, I guess I want to ask about medicalization is one of the strategies. But so where and who and how and with what money are studies being done to see if they can test the efficacy or even the mechanism? You were saying however many decades ago it's been said we will be able to show or measure that chi exists or whatever this energy is.
So
what's the status?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot more work on pilot programs looking at the effects of treatment than there have been on the actual mechanism, because the mechanism has been so challenging. I think there was a lot of interest in it in the 70s and 80s with Carillion photography, aura fields, and biophoton emission, bioplasmid fields, and things. There was a whole series of things that kind of looked promising, but then maybe didn't quite pan out. And so I think there's a lot more kind of clinical work being done than the actual biophysical work. And there are the big criticism I think that comes of the studies that have been done so far. A lot of them are small sample sizes. There's concern about cherry picking data. There's concerns about the designs, the study design, project design. But there have been some promising results. There have been some meta-analyses that say for certain types of chronic pain, for fibromyalgia, I think there's been work done actually through the veterans. I think there's some work in Texas through U.S. military stuff on PTSD that's been kind of suggestive. But the one big study that I know going on right now, I don't know if they're actually currently doing it, but I know they were planning it at the University of Utah Pain Management Center. There was a knee pain. So there was I guess so there's this subtle energies funding collective, which I think has a bunch of tech money basically, and they're people who've had very powerful experiences with energy healing, and they're we all know this works, but we have to show it in a really clinically valid way with a bigger, the problem is getting enough money to do those big sample sizes. And so they've put a bunch of money into this one study. And I think one of the people in charge of it told me, is that he talked to, I think, an orthopedic surgeon or someone and asked, what would, wow the medical community? What is the thing that, if you could do it, it would really have this big impact on people thinking this is valid? And they said knee pain. It's just it's something that's really hard, even with arthroscopic surgery and stuff. And so, yeah, they're doing, I don't know exactly how big it is, but this phase 2 trial at University of Utah now, and see how it goes. And I remember one of the things they said about why they did it on Reiki as opposed to other modalities is they want it to be repeatable, and there's just so many Reiki practitioners. It's the kind of most common form of energy medicine, so they're doing it, yeah.
Any other questions? All right.
Can I show my slides real quick? I skipped some slides. I just want to show it real quick. So this is just it's cool. Oh wait, can I go back? So I mentioned this is so these are Hawaii Takata's. That's her massage license from 1948, I think. 1947 from Honolulu, and her ministry card. She's signing a letter saying Reverend, and then these are the certificate cases. So these are her actual Japanese language certificates that she got from her Reiki master, which I was told. So the originals are in Santa Barbara, the Hawaii Takata archive that I helped put together after doing all this research. And Phyllis Furumoto, who's Hawaii Takata's granddaughter, said she really did not want the certificates photographed. There's special restrictions on them, but she did say these are photographs of the certificates, so these are okay to photograph. And so these cases, Hawaii Takata carried with her, I believe from the late 1940s up until her last classes in 1980. Here is a photo of her in Puerto Rico, where she's being interviewed for a newspaper, and when the image comes back, you'll see she's got these cases on the thing. So this one is her actual Japanese language Reiki certificates, whereas this one is from this esoteric fraternal order called the Indian Association of America. It's in chapter 4 of the book. It's kind of this organization that she joined that gave her basically the 1940s equivalent of the Universal Life Church ministry certificate. And she got the ministry certificate and also a Doctor of Naturopathy certificate. And they also, it's themed around Native practices, Native American practices, but how many of the people in the group actually were Native American is not quite clear. But she would tell stories about these Indian medicine men recognize that Reiki energy is the same as the energy that they use in their ceremony. She sent distance treatments to them, and that they felt the power, and they said, oh yeah, you've got the same power that we use. And so another one of these kind of universalizing moves, as well as this kind of drawing on somewhat suspect organization, right? This kind of, but yeah, she was a minister and a doctor of naturopathy from them. And I think the fact that her actual certificates from her teacher, right, as opposed to these ones when she sent $5 in the mail and got these certificates, the fact that she saw both of them as having power and of different types, and maybe showing to bolster different types of authority, that she carried them with her whole life. I think says, you know, volumes about kind of the precarious state of Reiki, maybe in post-war America, and maybe being Japanese American, right, traveling around. So yeah, anyway, that's what I wanted to show before, but I was talking to, I prepared too much, so.
No, great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.